Ellen, let's start with this OPEC meeting. This is the third meeting since Russia invaded Ukraine that we have seen. It really just only lasts 13 minutes. About 2 months ago, I was at CERAWeek in Houston talking to some of these oil ministers, and they said, oh, well, we're going to continue to address it. And yet you continue to see this 432,000 daily barrel increase per month. I'm curious how much of that is a consequence less of supply and demand and more of the inability to meet their quotas.
Yeah, we're seeing two things. One is that OPEC is really, and I think they understand it as well, and they've said as much as that there isn't much that they feel that they can do to impact the price situation, because the high prices are really very much caused by the geopolitical situation and the anticipation of further bans on Russian oil. So when the news from the EU came out, we saw WTI hitting $109 a barrel, and OPEC isn't really able to impact that. So they kind of use that either as an excuse in some ways, but that is their justification for basically just continuing along with the policy that they'd already decided. It, of course, has the very nice effect of not having to deal with the Russia question. They can basically just coast along without having to, negotiate or engage in negotiations with Russia over oil production. Then at the same time, though, we're seeing their actual production kind of stagnating in a sense. So while they can increase production, they're technically allowed to increase production, they're at least over 1 million barrels below where they could be producing. And that really begs the question, can they impact the market that much?
Well, and let's further, Ellen, with your expertise, connect the dots here, because you have one narrative of European nations distancing themselves from Russian energy supply, and then a global push towards some of those Gulf nations boosting the amount of oil in the market. What we seem to be leaving out of that conversation, though, is what makes up OPEC Plus and the relationship between those Gulf nations and Russia. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a really key part of OPEC Plus. I would go so far as to say that OPEC Plus really is Russia and its relationship with OPEC. The other countries that are involved are nice, but it's really Russia that makes the group. In fact, back when they originally agreed to this OPEC Plus group, it was Russia, in fact, and Russia's willingness to get in to go along with this and to get involved in it that actually brought OPEC as a group together. Before that, OPEC itself wasn't able to even agree on anything. So if they ever jettison Russia or make any moves towards jettisoning Russia, it would basically mean the end of the OPEC Plus group, and also the end of any future attempts to do any kind of coordinated market management. And so that's a really important issue for, in particular, the Gulf countries, because they know they need Russia on board.
Ellen, let's talk about spare capacity for a moment, because historically Russia has been aligned with the UAE within OPEC talks, if I'm correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I believe, are the only two countries right now who actually have enough spare capacity to perhaps make up for this perceived supply shortage. Where do we go next when it comes to getting Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular to pump more?
Yeah, you're exactly right about that. Last summer, we saw the UAE really push to increase production more than Saudi Arabia wanted, which introduced this rift between the two, whereas previously they'd always been on the same side. Russia, on the other hand, has always kind of pressed for more production. Now we're seeing some issues with Russia. We think that their production is probably down because simply of a lack of storage space for the oil, but the numbers aren't really in yet. And OPEC is really, they like to wait and see what the numbers show before acting. And so, the UAE has some spare capacity. Saudi Arabia definitely has spare capacity. Iraq probably has some as well, but they're not really employing it. In fact, Saudi Arabia has increased a little bit, but they're still well under their quotas. In fact, everyone in the group is basically producing under quota. And it's not really clear what it will take to get them to produce at least at quota, if not more. They believe that this won't really impact the price situation that much because it's not a lack of supply, of global supply that's causing the price issues. It's the geopolitical situation and the policies surrounding it.
Ellen, before we wrap things up, I just want to tie it back to the United States and the fact that obviously we saw the U.S. tap into those strategic reserves, looking at the price of oil, the effectiveness of that move. That's up for debate. But obviously something else being debated in Congress, that Senate push to essentially go after OPEC for manipulating the oil market. We'll see where that goes. We'll see whether or not even the president has to ultimately weigh in on that. But what do you think about those moves?
Yeah, exactly. The SPR release really has not had the intended effect. It hasn't brought oil prices down yet. I think that perhaps if we do start to see the effects of this oil, say building in inventories or in gasoline stocks and diesel stocks, then we may see some price relief from it. But as of now, it really has not had the intended effect. Of course, it's supposed to extend all the way through November. And so by the time the midterm elections roll around, we may see a bit of an effect from that. In terms of the NOPEC legislation that you're referring to, it's at the Senate Judiciary Committee today. And really, this kind of legislation is something that politicians want to pass to make it look like they're doing something. The question of whether anyone will actually try to sue OPEC members over this is another story entirely.